At the headquarters of Military Assistance Command Vietnam near Saigon, General Westmoreland and his senior officers ran a series of studies to try and predict where the enemy would strike in 1968. The enemy's Tet Offensive, though it had been predicted, took the U.S. Command by surprise. They suspected that the Vietcong would concentrate their efforts on the northern part of the country. The North Vietnamese army might use up to 5 divisions to try and capture South Vietnam's 2 northernmost provinces. Other attacks in the Highlands and near Saigon could provide the diversion. To counter the expected northern thrust, the Americans decided to send up their most mobile reaction force, the 1st Air Cavalry Division. In early January 1968, the division began the massive task of moving north together with other U.S. and South Vietnamese troops. By now, 3/4 of the American battalions in the South of Vietnam were deployed deep in the interior, near the Cambodian border. Unknown to them, elements of the NLF's 9th, 7th, and 5th Divisions, along with other units, were already heading towards the capital for the Tet Offensive. The Americans, suspicious of increased NLF radio traffic behind them and the lack of activity in the border areas, began a rapid redeployment back towards Saigon. American forces were pulled back from the border areas with astonishing speed. Such incredible mobility was something the Vietcong had never expected. The ploy to use the battles on the borders to draw the Americans away from the real targets of the Tet Offensive had failed, although it had allowed NLF forces to get closer to Saigon. It was Lieutenant General Frederick Wayand, the commander of the U.S. Second Field Force, that had requested the American redeployment. Soon, more than half his battalions were again at bases close to Saigon. Wayand ordered a series of sweeps to try and find the Vietcong units that were surely somewhere within reach. The Americans were now convinced that a major offensive was coming soon. However, no one imagined that the Vietcong were planning coordinated attacks across the whole country. Neither did anyone guess that they meant to break the traditional Tet New Year truce. As a precaution, the Americans did ask the South Vietnamese government to call off the truce and cancel army leave. But for political reasons, the request was refused. By the last week in January 1968, the Vietcong had almost completed the massive task of deploying 84,000 guerrillas for the Tet Offensive. Most of the movement of troops and supplies had successfully been kept secret. Even villagers who didn't support the Vietcong stayed neutral, and few reports of guerrilla activity reached the government's intelligence agencies. The traditional Vietcong base areas around Saigon, Districts like the Iron Triangle played a vital part in the Viet Cong's preparations. Even the huge tunnel complex at Cu Chi, which the Americans had long believed had been completely destroyed, was still an important staging area and command center. Nearer the city, the growing crowds of travelers arriving for the Tet celebrations covered the infiltration of guerrillas and their weapons. As Tet drew closer, General Giap, the North Vietnamese commander and architect of the offensive, began to worry that his forces might not be in place on time. As it happened, dozens of attacks were launched a full day too soon. The North was still using the old calendar, which gave Tet as the 31st of January. In the South, the official New Year was the 30th of January. The wave of Viet Cong assaults in the early morning of January 30th, 1968, confirmed to the Americans that the suspected offensive was underway. General Westmoreland ordered all his forces to be on maximum alert. At the same time, the South Vietnamese Prime Minister, Nguyen Van Thieu, announced that the Tet truce was over and canceled the army's leave. 36 of the 44 provincial capitals were attacked, as were 5 of the nation's cities. The premature attacks should have been a disaster for General Giap's plan, but in fact they were a great success, and Giap still had at least some elements of tactical surprise. American attention remained fixed on the northern border, where Westmoreland expected the real offensive to come. There, the Marine combat base at Khe Sanh had already been under siege for 10 days. In the rest of the country, although headquarters had sent out warnings, alerts happened all the time, and there was no real sense of urgency. Half the South Vietnamese Army's troops were still away from their units on leave. Even in the capital Saigon, the Viet Cong's most important objective, government forces were scattered and under strength.